Hello there! Since November of 2020, Creative Cat Productions has been anticipating the release of a Sega Master System Mini console, similar to the Sega Genesis Mini, which was released way back in September of 2019. Well, as you all know, we were wrong, and Sega of Japan is instead releasing a Mega Drive Mini 2, as well as a Sega Genesis Mini 2, both of which will contain a few Sega CD games. Now that is interesting, but it's not what we were hoping for. The Mega Drive has been done to death at this point, and I kinda think it's time to let it go. Just let it go. Just let it go, Sega! Of course there are rumors. There are always rumors. And once again, people are talking about Sega's next retro mini console even before anyone can declare the Genesis Mini 2 a victory or a defeat for the company. However, based upon early impressions of Sonic Frontiers, I'm far less optimistic for the future. In fact, I'm more concerned with whether or not Sammy will want to retain the name Sega much farther into the future, especially if Frontiers is not a critical and commercial hit. That being said, I'd still very much like to see a Sega Master System Mini, and so would a lot of other people as well. Indeed, a while back, Sega Lord X, who I think is related to Nintendo Master Y, and PC Engine Supervisor Z, put out a video where he selected around 40 games that he'd like to see on a Master System Mini, and people seem to really enjoy it. Some people like to put dried coconut on brownies.
You ruined it!
So we thought, hey, that looks fun. Let's put some dried coconut on our own brownies. And so therefore, we have created our own list of the 55 absolute best possible games for a hypothetical and wholly doubtable Sega Master System Mini. We were very careful about which games we've decided to include here. It's tempting to grab onto all of the most graphically impressive games for the Master System, but we wanted to create a list that is historically true to how the Master System was actually played in the 80s and 90s. Thus, we tried to avoid Game Gear games or ports of Sega Genesis games that were released very late in the console's lifespan. Further, we sought balance, so we've attempted to include a significant number of games from every genre over a broad spectrum of time. Further, we have, for practical reasons, excluded any games that were dependent upon the Master System's surprisingly large assortment of peripherals. This means no light gun games, no games made for the 3D glasses, no games requiring the paddle controller, and no games made for the Sega Sports Pad. Indeed, we just skip sports games altogether, because while the Master System has a fan base spread out across the whole world, sports games do not. Baseball is big in the US and Japan, Europeans and Brazilians love what we call soccer, and what we call football is inextricably an American phenomenon. Plus, with few exceptions, Master System sports games sucked anyway. So this selection is classically geeky with an emphasis on fantasy adventures, traditional platforming, space shooters, and RPGs. Sorry jocks, go make out with your hot girlfriends, because this video belongs to the Dungeons & Dragons daddies. Yeah! With that out of the way, we can begin. But let's start out at the very beginning, with the origins of the Master System itself. On July 15th, 1983, already a successful and well-known arcade manufacturer, Sega entered the home video game market in Japan with the release of the SG-1000. Incidentally, on that exact same day, a toy company called Nintendo did the exact same thing with a machine known as the Famicom, which would eventually be known as the NES in the United States of America. And while Nintendo's offering would go on to sell over 60 million units worldwide and define an entire generation, Sega's SG-1000 would fizzle out at 500,000 units sold. Thus, from 1983 and throughout the 80s, Sega would be forced into a game of constant catch-up, and their strategy was always the same: launch new hardware. Thus, in the summer of 1984, Sega retaliated with the release of the SG-1002, also known as the Sega Mark II. This version of the console introduced an improved, detachable controller and a cooler, high-tech look, but I kinda think it looks like a smoke detector. Whoa! Who's burning the okonomiyaki? Anyway, the following year in 1985, Sega would release the Mark III, which contained a number of substantial technological improvements designed to set it apart from the Nintendo Famicom. While the Mark III retained the same 8-bit Zilog Z80 processor, it now housed 8 kilobytes of random access memory, which is 4 times as much as the NES. And it also featured 16 kilobytes of dedicated video RAM and an expanded color palette palette of 64 colors, 32 of which could be on screen at any given time. The NES could only display 25 out of 48 colors on screen at any given time. The Mark III also included both a cartridge slot and a card reading slot for Sega's line of card-based games. In 1986, the Mark III was rebranded and repackaged as the Sega for its North American debut. The deluxe packaging of the Sega console, which included a light gun, was labeled as the Sega Master System, and that is the name that stuck. So in 1987, the Sega Master System was released in Europe, and a rebranded Mark III, also known as the Master System, was launched in Japan. The Sega Master System would serve as Sega's primary video game console from 1985 until 1988, when the Sega Mega Drive was released in Japan. Globally, the Master System was a fairly successful enterprise for Sega, especially in PAL territories, and in Brazil, where it continued to be supported well into the 90s and even into the 2000s. Getting accurate sales totals for old video game consoles is a highly dubious affair. Some sources will say that the Master System sold 20 million units, others will say it was closer to 10 million units, and resolving the discrepancy seems to hinge entirely upon whether or not you consider all of the Brazilian Master Systems made by Tectoy exclusively for the highly idiosyncratic Brazilian video game market to count as part of the total. Briefly, Tectoy is a Brazilian electronics manufacturer that established an exclusive deal with Sega in the 80s that allowed them to import, market, and even manufacture the Sega Master System in Brazil. However, Tectoy saw fit. At the time, Brazil had only just emerged from decades of military dictatorship and had suffered a rather nebulous relationship with the free market. Thus, allowing a local Brazilian company to autonomously handle the Sega brand was probably seen as the best solution to dealing with tricky Brazilian politics. As a consequence, Tectoy's Master System would become the dominant video game console in Brazil throughout the entirety of the 80s, the 90s, and even into the 2000s. Even after Sega of Japan had left the console market themselves in 2004, Tectoy was still producing Master Systems for Brazil in various forms. But Tectoy's version of the Master System was so geographically unique, with its own reiterations and its own library of reskinned games, that it's essentially a completely unrelated consideration. Looking at all these weird Tectoy Master Systems and Master System plug-in plays that catered to an economic bizarro world, I am inclined to not count the estimated 8 million Tectoy Master Systems that were sold in Brazil. They're just too weird. In its home country of Japan, however, the Master System was a relative flop. The Nintendo Famicom was tough to compete with so many game publishers and developers eager to outdo each other in Japan's broadest and most accessible video game market. By the early 90s, the Nintendo Famicom had a library exceeding 1,000 games. The Sega Master System, on the other hand, failing to garner much third-party interest, only saw 312 games, and many of its games were eventually nothing more than recycled titles for the Game Gear. The Master System was also a major flop in the United States, where Nintendo was the practically unchallenged king of the 80s. Once again, the Master System simply couldn't compete with Nintendo's vast array of quality titles, and plus someone at Sega thought box art like this might be appealing to store shelves. They were very wrong. In Europe, the situation was a bit different. The popular narrative is that Sega was king in Europe. I guess that makes it Charlemagne, but I'm not so sure this is quite true. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the Master System had a larger share of the video game market, which is still shared with Nintendo, who struggled with distribution in Europe, and microcomputers like the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64. Either way, many Europeans have fond memories of the Sega Master System, while most Americans have never so much as touched one. And Canada, being traditionally tied to the UK, seems to also be part of the Sega Master System's success, and I've noticed that tons of Canadians love the Master System. This story seems to extend to Australia as well. But overall, most people regard the Master System as a failure, since it wasn't popular in the US and Japan, where it was all but abandoned in favor of the Mega Drive, also known as the Sega Genesis, by 1989. But the Master System's failure wasn't due to having bad games, but more or less, it just didn't have enough games, at a time when most families were only willing to bear the cost of a single video game console in their home at any given time. So let's look at 55 of those games now. But first we gotta mention Snail Maze, a feature that must be included on any hypothetical Master System Mini that could be released in the future. Snail Maze is a quirky little mini game that was built into early models of the Master System, and which played whenever you powered on the console without a game cartridge inserted into the console, whilst simultaneously holding both up on the D-pad and both buttons 1 and 2. And this is it. It's Snail Maze. Wow, it's barely a game at all, but it's definitely interesting, and it is actually possible to complete all 12 mazes within the time limit, if you've memorized the correct pathways. Why was this game included? Who made it? No one really seems to know. It's got a cute little tune, the mazes are well done, and someone has obviously put some effort into this. But why? I guess Sega just wanted people to have something to play, even if they didn't have any games to play with. Now that's customer service. But yeah, a Master System Mini absolutely must have a way to play Snail Maze, even if it really doesn't count towards being one of the featured games. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the real list. We've grouped the 55 games in question according to their US release date for the sake of convenience, but let's start with 4 games that were released for the original Sega Mark III in Japan in 1985. Here we go! Hang On was a launch title for the Sega Mark III in October of 1985, and it came on the nifty Sega MyCard format. This radically stripped down 8-bit home conversion of Yu Suzuki's popular motorcycle arcade game came out just months after the original, and was followed up just weeks after that with a sequel called Hang On 2 for the SG-1000. So not only was Sega still fully supporting the SG-1000 and Mark II in 1985 and 1986 actually, but they were undercutting their new hardware by releasing sequels for their old hardware just months later. This is crazy. Why on earth did Sega always insist on competing with themselves? If you want a reasonable explanation as to why maybe the Mark III failed in Japan, then look no further than this sort of decision making. Anyway, Hang On is, for 1985, quite an impressive little game, with smooth scrolling graphics that help make this game thoroughly playable, even if it is a bit dull after a while. The backgrounds and colors will change as you race past checkpoints, while evading other motorcycles, but the absence of music makes the abrasive sound effects that much more punishing. Still, in 1985, this was one of the best racing games out there, and possibly the best racing game ever made for a home console up until this point. It's no wonder why Sega frequently used Hang On as their pack-in game for the console. It's just a shame the Sega MyCard lacked the memory required to include the epic Hang On music from the arcade game. But somehow Hang On 2 for the SG-1000 and Sega Mark II, released less than 2 months after Hang On for the Master System, actually did manage to include the music. This is such a weird decision. The other launch game for the Sega Mark III in Japan, and yet another game utilizing the Sega MyCard format, is Teddy Boy Blues, an arcade-style action platformer based on a now obscure Sega arcade game called Teddy Boy Blues, which came out the same year. The arcade game was actually named after a hit song, also from 1985, called Teddy Boy Blues, which was performed by J-pop idol Yoko Ishino. Indeed, the arcade version featured a computerized version of the song's melody and images of Yoko Ishino scattered throughout the game, including a mini-game where you could control the singer in her apartment. The Sega Mark III version retains the cutesy J-pop music, which is unfortunate because it plays across all 51 of this game's levels. But the Sega Master System version drops the Teddy Boy Blues in favor of another original song, which is actually quite enjoyable, save for the fact that it too is the only song found in the game. Gameplay-wise, Teddy Boy Blues, or just Teddy Boy as it was known over here, is actually a very fun and addictive little game. Essentially play as this little Jewish kid with a green yarmulke who's been sent to shoot everyone and everything that he sees with a shrink ray so that he can steal them for his evil collection. Shoot and shrink all the creatures and you win. The levels are interesting, though janky, and not much more elaborate than your typical one-screen platformer from the time period. Once you start to get good, Teddy Boy can be a lot of fun, and is probably the best game of the 2 launch titles for the Sega Master System. Mazel tov! Also released in 1985 on the Sega MyCard format, just in time for Japanese Christmas, which is one of the weirdest kinds of Christmas, was Pit Pot, one of the weirdest kinds of games for the Sega Mark III. And that's something, because we just played Teddy Boy Blues. Wow! In Pit Pot, you play as a knight named Eggle, or Iggle, who will eventually reappear the next year as Alex Kidd's twin brother in Alex Kidd in Miracle World. So yeah, Pit Pot is sort of the prequel to the Alex Kidd games. So anyway, Eggle has to save the princess, who's been taken to a castle that's guarded by an army of Oni, troll-like demons from Japanese mythology. Luckily, a witch drops a hammer, either to help you or maybe just as an accident, and so now at least you have a weapon. Talk about coming unprepared. Anyway, once inside the castle, the game starts and it's pretty straightforward. Somewhere in the maze of rooms is a sleeping princess, but the goal isn't actually to just save her, but marry her. So you'd better come prepared with the 3 treasures: a potion to lift the sleeping beauty curse, a cross to keep her from turning evil, and a ring so you can get married. Get all 3 and find her, and then you beat the game. Mechanically, Pit Pot is supposed to be based around breaking tiles with the hammer, but this ability is almost never helpful. More like just a way to accidentally kill yourself. It's fairly easy to hit enemies with, but honestly, the best strategy is to simply avoid them. They tend to mind their own business anyway. Every room basically looks the same, with the same Takashi Murakami paintings on every wall. Neither that or someone's kid decided to decorate the walls on their own. Once you've memorized the location, got the treasures, and saved the princess, this game can be beaten in less than 20 minutes. And it's never really all that engaging, especially once you figure out that the game's central mechanic is practically useless, and really your best bet is to just run around and collect all the treasures. The Sega Mark III version of this game has a level editor that's even more useless than your hammer, since it only lets you edit the tiles in the very first room of the game. This rather pointless feature was removed from Western versions, which was commonly found as a pack-in game. Pit Pot's not bad, but it's not good either. But it is a unique historical moment, and its status as a pack-in game makes me compelled to want to include it on this list. 1986. In 1986, the Mark III was officially launched in North America as the Sega system. You could get a base system, which included the Sega console and 2 controllers, and I believe the original pack-in game was Hang On, or you could get the Master System, which also included the Light Phaser, and both Hang On and Safari Hunt. There are actually quite a few good Light Phaser games, but it's very doubtful that any of them would ever appear in a retro mini console, so unfortunately, we're not talking about any of them. However, let's start with another early Master System game that was also a pack-in game in some regions: Astro Warrior. Astro Warrior is a very simple, very satisfying vertical shooter with only 3 levels of gameplay that continuously loop and increase in difficulty. You can gain power-ups and options that periodically descend in order to increase your firepower, and constantly smashing enemies with your laser has a satisfying crunch that could only be delivered by people who really understand what makes shooters so spectacularly fun in the first place. It triggers that dopamine-seeking reward loop, and it's the same phenomenon that keeps gamblers in front of slot machines, makes fast food addictive, and is at the very heart of the reason why people like me will continuously punish themselves with these treacherously difficult and yet repetitive games like this. It's not rational per se to like these kinds of games, but it is entirely neurochemical, and if you know any meth heads, then you know it can kinda take over your life. However, thankfully, Sega didn't include a rapid fire feature, so your finger will just tire out before you end up toothless and wandering the streets of LA looking for your next Astro Warrior fix. This ain't no Legend of Zelda or Donkey Kong, but I need this game on a Master System Mini, and I mean that literally. Next, let's talk about Ghost House, a 1986 action platformer featuring a little black-haired elf boy who also happens to be an incredibly effective vampire hunter. Indeed, the name of this game should have been Vampire Killer because that's actually the primary objective of each and every level. Each stage is a large side-scrolling labyrinth containing various monsters, helpful objects, treasure, traps, and 5 different sleeping vampires locked away in coffins hidden throughout the level. And the vampires are guarding precious gems that you must collect before escaping to the next level. At first, playing this surprisingly deep and lengthy game that was released on the card format of all things is quite perplexing, but this is what you need to do. First, you need to fight the regular monsters on the stage until one eventually drops a key. Now you can unlock a coffin to a vampire by touching it. This triggers a boss fight with a bouncing Dracula. You get a generous life bar, but he will kick your ass. What you need to do is jump in front of any of the game's many candles, which will cause a sword to fly across the screen. Your first instinct will be to dodge the sword, but actually what you're supposed to do is jump on top of it. Now you can grab it and use it. So dodge Dracula in his bat form and wait for him to stand still in his fancy clothes, and then unleash a second death upon him with the sword. Grab the heart to refill your life bar, and then repeat this process 4 more times until you've beaten the level. This will then trigger a special glowing door to appear somewhere hidden in the level, and once you've found it and gone inside, you've won! Later levels contain new enemies in the form of mummies and some swapped colors, but generally gameplay is identical and pretty fun. And keep in mind, you can jump on top of enemies like the Mario Brothers, in addition to your punch attack. Ghost House is a weird and quirky game that not too many people talk about, but it really is one of the best early Master System games. Then there's World Grand Prix. This is yet another smooth-scrolling racing game that was a sequel to the SG-1000 game that was itself based on a bizarre but amazing arcade game that successfully managed to combine video footage of actual roads with pixelated video game cars. World Grand Prix on the Master System is not that interesting. It looks like Namco's pole position and plays pretty much identical to the Master System version of Hang On, but it does add a few things that made it a top game in 1986. You get points at the end of each of the 12 unique tracks in the game that can then be spent to upgrade your car for future races. You can improve your acceleration rate, how your car handles in turns, and the engine, which I assume affects your top speed. Thus, there is a fun element of progression that rewards skilled gameplay, but on top of that, there's a track editor that allows you to race your own creations, something pretty spectacular for 1986. Fantasy Zone for the Sega Master System is a technically impressive port of an arcade shooter released the same year. Both games were a hit in Japan, and the protagonist, the little anthropomorphized spaceship known as Opa Opa, has often been regarded as a kind of mascot for Sega. The Master System version seen here was developed simultaneously alongside the arcade game and recycled many of the arcade game's assets at a lower resolution. The hardware limitations of the Master System, however, were such that the bosses had to be completely reworked and even recycled. The gameplay is fun, fast, and ferociously difficult, with levels that scroll both to the left and the right in a loop. But I've always found the most noteworthy aspect to be the game's loud and garishly colorful art style, that I think not only inspired the entire Q-em-up subgenre, but indeed an entire art movement called Superflat, by the contemporary Japanese artist Takashi Murakami. Just compare Murakami's 2002 Flowers to any level in Fantasy Zone. In fact, Murakami's art looks like exactly any level in the game. Now all we need is that super catchy Fantasy Zone music. Choplifter started out as a side-scrolling military helicopter game for the Apple II home computer that emphasized rescuing people from a war zone. It was published by Broderbund and was soon ported to almost every possible platform. In 1985, Sega released an enhanced version of Choplifter for the arcades. And this is the version of the game I am most familiar with because this cabinet was very popular and very common going straight on into the 90s. The game featured ultra smooth scrolling and copious amounts of layers in order to create a deep parallax effect. The unique emphasis on rescuing people and airlifting them to safety while battling tanks and fighter jets was fun and refreshing. Choplifter kicks ass, but it must not have been as popular in Japan because in 1986, a port of Sega's arcade version was released exclusively in North America. And then it was released the following year in Europe and PAL territories as one of the system's launch games. Despite the downgrade in hardware from Sega's System 1 arcade board to the Master System, the home version of Choplifter plays very close to the arcade game, and even includes that nice-looking parallax scrolling. In 1986, this was one of the best action games you could play at home across all possible platforms, including the Nintendo Famicom, which would get an inferior port of Choplifter that same year. Since the Sega Master System didn't include the arcade version's fourth and final level, instead you'll find that there is a battleship level and a scary cave level, and in that way it's kind of an improvement on the original. But yeah, this is Choplifter. Choplifter is great. Then there's Black Belt, a reskinned and slightly reworked beat-em-up that was originally a game based on the anime The Fist of the North Star in Japan. What really made this game relevant in 1986, however, wasn't the anime license or this incredible box art. Look at that. But rather, it was the fact that this was Sega's ultra badass response to the popularity of Kung Fu Master on the Famicom and NES, one of the early big hits that made Nintendo's video game console a success. So everything about Black Belt is bigger, badder, and even better. When you hit enemies in Black Belt, they explode. There are mini-bosses, even special big boss stages that transform your Master System into an arcade fighting game, roughly half a decade before fighting games were even a relevant genre. Check out that big kick, and look how the Black Belt can jump into the sky. Wow! It's like real life, man! Best of all, while Kung Fu was just a super short, samey climb up some stairs of a Chinese pagoda, where you had to beat up kids for some reason, I never understood that. Black Belt is by comparison a massive adventure with 5 unique levels, spanning Kung Fu temples, cityscapes, and a battle with a sumo wrestler. One of just 6 epic boss fights with moderately janky controls and mysterious hitboxes that I still don't fully understand. Did I hit him? I don't know, but I do know that this is cooler than Irem's Kung Fu by at least a mile. Next is Secret Command, which was known as Rambo First Blood Part 2 in North America. And what it is a pretty great overhead run and gun in the fashion of Capcom's Commando. And other than the name, it has nothing to do with Rambo, except for the exploding arrows. The gameplay is a bit sluggish, but it's also pretty well crafted and fun once you get a little practice in. Most games in this genre are prone to bullshit deaths, and that's not the case here. Plus, the soundtrack is one of the best on the Master System, in spite of not utilizing the FM sound unit. Next is The Ninja, which is an overhead run and gun set in medieval Japan, wherein you play as this little dude in colorful traditional Japanese garb as he embarks on a quest to save the princess. But where in the heck is the ninja? The box art depicts something that looks like a ninja, and ninjas pop out of nowhere throughout the game. But this person's not a ninja. You're dressed in loud, bright colored clown clothes, and you run across a naked field in broad daylight. This is basically the opposite of how a ninja operates. Actually, this game is a remake of an excellent arcade game called Ninja Princess from the year before, where the main hero is actually a cute girl. So maybe the Master System version also features a girl, and all these clothes are from her summer Instagram wardrobe, and she wants everyone to see. That could explain the ponytail. Either way, The Ninja is a fantastic game with unique, challenging levels, fun gameplay mechanics like the ability to temporarily go both invisible and invincible at the same time, anytime you like, and even a handy strafing button that helps you plow through enemies like a colorful Japanese Rambo. hero, but nothing at all like a ninja. This game is short but challenging, and I consider it one of my top 10 favorite Master System games, despite the silly protagonist. They should have stuck with the ninja princess. She was a cooler character than this. Next is Captain Silver, a Sega remake of a Data East action platformer that has a fun pirate setting and lots of whimsical charm. It looks a little bit like Puke, but it's fun to play once you realize each level is basically a game of Scrabble, as you try and spell out the word Captain Silver. Does this game have anything to do with Treasure Island or Long John Silver, the American fish and chips chain? Well, kind of. The hero of this game is set off to find Captain Silver's lost treasure, which means swashbuckling on ships, exploring caves, and battling ferocious dragons.
And what be Captain Silver's treasure, you be asking?
Who knows?
But I think it be 2 succulent fillets of fried Pacific cod, served with a side of fries, hush puppies, and young Jim Hawkins' classic coleslaw.
All for $9.99. Can you defeat the Caribbean natives trying to defend their land? Find out in this exciting adventure brought to you by Pepsi. Yum. Next is Alex Kidd in Miracle World, the every direction scrolling super game designed by Kotaro Hayashida to be the Sega Master System's Mario killer. And, incidentally, it was also originally supposed to be a Dragon Ball game. But unfortunately, Sega lost the license, and Hayashida and his development team had to rework the game into something original. But if you squint just right, you'll see that some of the Dragon Ball elements remain. Evil pterodactyls, Lord Pilaf, shooting fireballs, and Capsule Corp vehicles. Alex Kidd in Miracle World was an innovative platforming adventure in 1985, but it didn't quite reach Super Mario Bros. Heights of gaming perfection. However, thanks to being the Master System's pack-in game for years, especially on the influential Master System 2, it is for many people the most essential of all Master System games. I've personally always found this game to be just okay, but if it had gotten that Dragon Ball license, then I probably would have loved it. Let's look at Alien Syndrome, an overhead run-and-gun game that was a port of a Sega arcade game that ran on the Sega System 16 arcade board. The obvious inspiration for this game, which is confirmed by this less than subtle box art, is the Alien movie franchise. And Alien Syndrome really does successfully tap into the anxiety created by those films, with spooky minimalist music, timed levels, and swarms of respawning xenomorphs that are in the way of your mission to rescue as many human captives as possible and escape before your spaceship explodes. Go, 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 go! Every second counts, and there's no map in the Master System version, so it's time to break out your Dungeons & Dragons grid paper and start making one. I don't know, but if you were like me in the 80s, then making your own map was basically half the fun anyway. Scattered throughout each level are weapons placed on walls, as indicated by letters. L is the laser gun. S is the smart bomb that destroys all enemies on screen. FB is the fireball, which is my personal favorite. And once all your comrades, yes, the game refers to them as comrades, I guess these are capitalist aliens. Once all your comrades are rescued for the glorious revolution, then you can make your way to the exit. Unless, of course, the time runs out, and then you die anyway. But let's say you did make it, then you'll encounter one of 7 boss fights, which feature disgusting creatures like this. What the heck is even going on here? Alien Syndrome has 6 levels, each with unique color schemes, layouts, and aliens to fight. But the gameplay is identical across all 6. Run, gun, and rescue before the time goes off and kills everyone. Granted, this game isn't much to look at, and it is extremely hard, but I do find the emphasis on exploration and rescuing captives to be a fun take on a classic genre. Alien Syndrome isn't great, but it's definitely one of our favorite Master System games anyway. Next, let's talk about the Master System port of Space Harrier. When Space Harrier the arcade game was released to arcades in 1985, its incredible sprite scaling graphics stunned kids across the world.
Whoa, badass!
So how then did Sega's own home version fare on the little Master System? Well, it's surprisingly decent.
Whoa, this isn't that bad. Yeah, this should suck, dude.
In spite of having predictably horrible scrolling graphics with a choppy frame rate that makes everything look like a 1970s prog rock music video, I'm still able to somehow dodge and hit enemies as if I could actually tell where the hell I'm supposed to be from 1 second to the next. Seriously, it's like trying to hit a baseball in a dark room with a strobe light, and then you actually do, and it's like, how? It's anyone's guess. The hitboxes on enemies must be huge. Indeed, I'm pretty sure you can see them. As a home port of a technologically advanced arcade masterpiece, Space Harrier for the Master System is really good, at least interesting. As a rail shooter assessed for its own merits, it's just okay. But in 1987, you would have shocked your friends with that battle with the dragon in level 1. That was quite impressive. Next, let's talk about a quirky space shooter for the Master System called Global Defense, which is a port of an arcade game called SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative. And as you can see, it's a game where you play as a freaking satellite orbiting the planet Earth. Your mission? To defend Earth from an insane barrage of missiles, spaceships, and what looks like evil bits of DNA. Why is this happening? It's not clear to me, but you're a badass satellite on a mission of global defense. But only after the World Trade Center is destroyed in the opening cutscene. This isn't just ominous foreshadowing. Global Defense is one of the only Master System games to have a title screen with an animated intro like this. Gameplay for Global Defense seems to confuse people, but it's actually solid once you figure out the controls. You see, the satellite stays fixed in place as it orbits Earth, and the D-pad controls a cursor that represents where the satellite will damage enemies with its laser. Move the cursor over an enemy and press button 2 and you destroy the enemy. But in order to maneuver the satellite out of its fixed position, you must hold down button 1 while changing directions with the D-pad. Thus, the idea is to shoot everything, then reposition yourself strategically to ensure you keep destroying everything without getting hit. It's simple to learn, but hard to master. Global Defense has pretty impressive graphics for 1987 and supports the FM sound unit, which produces some surprisingly solid background music while you're wiping out evil missiles. It's no Gradius, but I still think this is a fun shooter for people who love tough games, or who think satellites are cool. I bet Elon Musk would love this game. Best of all though, this game supports 2-player simultaneous co-op gameplay. Player 1 moves the satellite, the other controls the cursor. Save the world together with Global Defense for the Sega Master System. Next, let's talk about Wonderboy, one of the best platformers for the Sega Master System and an outstanding port of the 1986 arcade game of the same name. It's the original Wonderboy. The obvious comparison everyone wants to make with this game is to Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. But let's be real, this toe-headed wonder smokes Mario with his radical skateboarding moves and hatchet-throwing madness. Plus, Wonderboy is actually quite long. Completing Wonderboy, a task that's easier said than done, can take you well over an hour. Yes, the game recycles many backgrounds and assets to achieve this length, such as the head-swapping final boss you encounter periodically, but there's a lot of creativity in how these things are all reused. Wonderboy is deceptively primitive in its mechanics and cute, colorful presentation, but the game is packed with surprises and little touches that will keep you coming back for more. More snacks, that is. Like a real-life Wonderboy, this Wonderboy's gotta eat all the time, or eventually he dies. It's a good thing that food is hidden all over the place. If you kick these eggs open, you get cool upgrades like the ability to throw projectiles, the fun skateboard that greatly speeds you up, or the fairy of total freaking destruction. She will absolutely crush everything in your path. Watch out for these little tricky platforms. And if you're really good, grab that doll bonus in every level as you eat, murder, and skateboard your way to final victory, claiming the ultimate prize above all prizes, a girl. And now Wonderboy will have to find even more food because let me tell you, girls need to eat too, dude. Wonderboy looks dorky, but it is seriously a great game and easily one of the best 20 platformers of that first generation of platformers, from whence it comes. We love it. Next is Enduro Racer, an isometric motorcycle game for the Sega Master System that was 100% different than the Sega arcade game of the same name. Whereas Hang On was a straightforward rice rocket racer over manicured tracks, Enduro Racer is a wild and bumpy motocross dirt bike challenge. I guess that makes these redneck rockets. So get out your denim jacket and crank up the Pantera, because this game is gonna rock out over deserts and swamps, and literally rocky crevices. There's a lot of action in this game because you have to navigate the terrain and then hit the ramps just right to get height and speed and avoid other racers without killing yourself. At the end of each race you get points, which can be used to buy parts to make you faster, and you definitely want to go as fast as possible until you're finally dead. It's like a way of life, man. Enduro Racer is not as talked about as its contemporaries, but I regard this mulleted legend as one of the best games on the Master System. The 80s arcades had their Kung Fu Masters and Double Dragons, and the Sega Master System had its popular Black Belt, but the real baddest ass on the block was the Kung Fu Kid, a sequel to an obscure SG-1000 game called Dragon Wang. The Kung Fu Kid is a Master System exclusive, and for me, it's a top 10 game for the system, for no other reason than the fact that it's extremely fun. And Wang, this little dude is Wang, he's having fun too. Just look at that hair as he goes flying through the air. I love how he jump kicks the hell out of everything. He doesn't even have a punch attack. Why waste your time with that? Just kick everybody in the face. Hold up and button 2 and you throw a white thing that destroys everything in front of it. This game has 7 unique levels, each with their own quirks and unique epic boss fight. Everything in this game looks like it's a Chinese restaurant straight out of the 1950s. But watch out for level 6. It's an epic battle with boss after boss after boss. But don't despair, because the hit detection is good, the game is masterable, and it can be beaten with a little practice and patience. Kung Fu Kid for the Sega Master System? Well, it kicks ass, literally. Of all the famous super scaling games that Sega could have brought over to the Master System, Outrun made the least sense. As an arcade game, its appeal was derived almost entirely from its amazing super smooth graphics and incredible soundtrack. It's a magical sound shower of 1980s aesthetic wonder. Indeed, people love the Outrun vibe so much that it's inspired an entire new musical genre called Outrun. But the 8-bit Master System, even with the FM sound unit, wasn't really intended to recreate the same kind of experience. But Sega tried anyway, and while the results aren't exactly impressive, it is at least admirable in its attempt at fidelity. The main issue, of course, is with the constant sprite scaling required to create this game's sense of speed. The Master System simply can't do it, and thus the game looks extremely choppy and is, at times, hard to play for the wrong reasons. The sound is tinny and screechy, but amazingly, Outrun's smooth continuity between levels and sense of adventurous progression as you drive across a virtual America is recreated like a passing breeze. Even more amazing is the fact that all 5 possible endings from the arcade original have made their way to the Master System, which gives this game a level of replayability that was wholly unique in its time. Thus, while Outrun is far from perfect, it was and always shall be an essential title for Sega's 8-bit powerhouse. Based on a Japanese animated TV series of the same name that ran for 1 season in 1987, Zilean for the Sega Master System is one of the most unique games of the late 80s. Its closest analog is most definitely the C64 classic Impossible Mission, which, like Zilean here, featured tons of underground tunnels, elevator action, and espionage on computers hidden away in locked chambers. Zilean looks like it's an action game, but it's really more about navigating this large subterranean base and hacking your way to victory at various computer terminals requiring codes that you uncover as you play. Eventually, you'll rescue 2 more playable characters, set a self-destruct sequence on the bad guy base, and face a difficult timed escape that will test your memory. Zilean honestly gets pretty tedious after a while, but the concept is definitely exciting in small doses, and thus it stands as one of the most interesting games on the Master System, if not necessarily among the best. Next is Fantasy Zone 2, featuring the return of Opa Opa, the sentient little spaceship who will kill and destroy everything in order to grab as much money as possible. Kill, 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 and get that paper, dog! Anyway, 10 years have passed since all of the stuff that happened from the first game, and now the enemy is back and little Opa Opa is on the attack, baby! This time levels are even crazier, as you warp between not one, not two, but 3 sets of backgrounds, as you mercilessly hunt down your prey and eliminate the alien threat, which consists entirely of cutesy smiling creatures like this. Boost up your arsenal by spending some money in the shop, and then take on the screen-filling end-of-level bosses, which as always, are the most fun and challenging part of any Fantasy Zone game. If you love Fantasy Zone 1, then you'll definitely enjoy Fantasy Zone 2 on the Master System. But if cute-em-ups aren't your bag, then I don't think this will necessarily convert you. Personally, I really enjoyed this game. Penguin Land was released for the Sega Master System in North America in 1988, and it is a peculiar platforming puzzler about a penguin trying to move her egg down a treacherous obstacle course in order to get it to safety in some kind of subterranean space base. Did I mention that the penguin spaceship seems to have crash landed on the moon? Mastery of this game is all about learning its quirky rules. The mama can roll her egg and even hop on top of it, and she can break ice with her beak to move down a level. She can make boulders fall and use them to murder polar bears. The egg can fall, but not too far, or it dies. Also, if the egg gets stuck in the ice and you land on it, it dies. If the polar bear touches it, it dies. If this brick hits it, it dies. If this smasher smashes it, it dies. So you're gonna have to try a lot of different approaches to get your egg to safety. So I guess the best approach is to slowly plan your strategy, learn from your mistakes, and try again. It's not exactly a game about instant gratification, like a shooter, but it's pretty fun to navigate these little courses, and it's a well-crafted brain puzzler that rewards your persistence and cleverness. Once you get the hang of Penguin Land's 30 or so levels, it can become a lot of fun to challenge yourself to beat your scores in completion time. One of the best features of Penguin Land, however, is the inclusion of a level editor that allows you to build your own challenging course. The tools are easy to use, and it's fun to see how hard game design can really be. Can you make a level that isn't a broken mess? Probably not. Or find out with Sega's Penguin Land. Only on the Sega Master System. In 1988, Sega would release the Aztec Adventure on the Sega Master System, which was known in Japan as Nazca 88, likely because this game makes some references to the famous Nazca lines out in Peru. This colorful and stylish overhead action adventure game is frequently overlooked, even by fans of the Sega Master System, but we at Creative Cat Productions regard the Aztec Adventure as a lost treasure that's well worth exploring. While the cute cartoon graphics appear to emulate an anime of some sort, we've never been able to find any evidence that this game was based on any popular media, though the main protagonist does look mysteriously like Esteban from 1982's Mysterious Cities of Gold. Coincidence? Maybe not. While the Aztec Adventure looks like a Zelda clone, it's more of an overhead action game with adventure-like elements, and the game is broken up into discrete linear levels that only create the feeling of an open-world adventure without the necessity of backtracking. The first unique mechanic that you'll encounter, which is hinted at the title screen, is the ability to throw money at competing adventurers in order to bribe them to join your team. Being bribed, Esteban and his bot friends will fight together through the game's unique levels and challenges. For instance, in the jungle level, you'll need to be sure to collect these fire power-ups that allow you to burn foliage, obstructing your path down the road. While the Aztec Adventure is a little slow-moving and suffers from short sword syndrome, once you learn its quirks and get a feel for the flow, it's a very fun game with an outstanding unique look. This is a really underappreciated game. The Sega Master System's most successful game of 1988 was their home port of Afterburner, a super-scaling arcade rail shooter that attempted to recreate the excitement of jet fighter combat from movies like Top Gun. Unfortunately, as with all of the other attempts to recreate super-scaling graphics on an 8-bit Master System, the results are really choppy and confusing to look at, and therefore gameplay takes a big hit. Still, at the same time, Afterburner came on a 4 meg cartridge and looked impressive for a Master Master System game. It's not a flight simulator, and to be fair, it's barely much of a game at all. All you have to do is hit the targets as they move forward past you, and then roll and dodge the missiles as they come back forward again. Rinse and repeat. The Master System makes this formula even tamer due to the fact that the first few levels can be easily beaten simply by hanging out in the upper left corner of the screen. If you stay there, basically nothing can hit you. And since you've also got infinite missiles at your disposal, there's no need to reserve them for tough targets. Just blast away on the buttons and hide out in that corner and you're destined to win. If you can tell what's going on, then there is some fun to be had with Afterburner, but most people will probably give up the first time they're shot down. But that's today. Back in 1988, you'd have put on your aviators and just been grateful that you could play any port of Afterburner at all. For my money, the most underrated game on the Sega Master System in 1988 is Fantasy Zone: The Maze, a game that whimsically combines many of the key elements of the Fantasy Zone series with the core game mechanics of something like Pac-Man. The result is a game that's fun and original, and one of the few truly great simultaneous co-op games available for the system. If you recall Fantasy Zone, then you'll know it's a colorful side-scrolling shooter where you gather gold coins that you can use to spend on weapons and upgrades to your cute little spaceship, the famous Opa Opa. Well, Fantasy Zone: The Maze is just Pac-Man, but with Opa Opa, and his brother Oopa Oopa, who have the ability to grab weapons that allow them to fight back against the enemies chasing you in the maze. And instead of dots, you gather coins that can be used toward the purchase of guns and upgrades that only encourage you to fight even more, which is only further reinforced by the fact that killing enemies is the best source of money in the game. So it's like a crazy game of offensive Pac-Man, and I'm all for it. If you're a Pac-Man purist, well, this game will probably offend your sensibilities, but I find this take on the maze genre to be really cool. Fantasy Zone: The Maze is, in my opinion, one of the best games for the system, and it stands apart as one of the only Master System takes on this classic formula. Wonderboy and Monsterland is the sequel to Wonderboy. And boy, is this game different. Different from the original, and different from pretty much everything else that you could play at the time. In 1988, a really great port of Wonderboy and Monsterland was released for the Sega Master System in North America, and fans will often tell you that this is indeed one of the best games ever made for the 8-bit console. Wonderboy and Monsterland borrows many elements from fantasy-themed action RPGs. You have heart-based life bars, you can explore things, find secrets, talk to NPCs that give you hints, purchase items, upgrade your weapons, upgrade your armor, and equip secondary weapons. And yet all of this adventuring is organized across 12 discrete levels with their own beginning, unique environmental quirks, hidden areas, and end-of-level bosses to engage in battle for treasure, new weapons, and sometimes just the exit to the next area. Monsterland utilizes cutesy super deformed graphics and lots of tight platforming and ladder climbing. I can't help but notice that this game probably had to have been a major inspiration for Capcom's Mega Man. Even the way you have to enter these special chambers to take on these well-crafted bosses in order to acquire new weapons for progression feels a lot like Mega Man. Don't let Monsterland's mildly dorky aesthetic and soft beginning deter you. This is really an outstanding game from start to finish. One of Sega's greatest action franchises in the 80s and 90s was of course Shinobi, and the home port of the original Shinobi for the Sega Master System is no exception. It's one of the best action platformers for the Master System, and one of the best games of 1988 in general. Now first impressions might be deceiving here because Shinobi kinda looks like crap. It uses sickening color combinations like pink and bright yellow, has these wonky sprites that look all garbled and monstrous, and you'd better love the Shinobi theme song because it plays throughout the entire game, which can take even the most skilled players roughly 30 minutes to beat. No, Shinobi on the Master System is not the aesthetic wonder people are used to when it comes to Shinobi games, but what it lacks in looks and sound, it makes up for in the well-designed gameplay and fun little touches that set it apart from its arcade counterpart, like the original emphasis here on rescuing children tied up throughout each level. In the arcade, you needed to find them all to exit the stage, but in the Master System they also offer power-ups, new weapons, and can even refill your life. And yes, you now have a life bar, so there's no need to worry about frustrating one-hit deaths. In this version, you can use swords, nunchucks, throw bombs, and more, which can drastically change the way the game is played, offering a fun layer of variety. There were a lot of ports of Shinobi in the late 80s. Some definitely had better graphics, but none played as well or were as interesting as Shinobi for the Master System. Until the Revenge of Shinobi in 1989, this might have been the best Shinobi game ever made. Miracle Warriors is an RPG. An RPG on the Sega Master System? Indeed it is. There were a few notable RPGs on the Master System, and Miracle Warriors is one of the most beloved. It's also among the most primitive and aged. And I don't mean like a fine wine, but more like a middle-aged dad standing around in the kitchen clutching his car keys and trying to remember where he's going. Miracle Warriors is old school, and in fact it's one of the oldest JRPGs released on a video game console ever, which means it's heavy on stats, merciless grinding, and short on direction, story, character development, or clarity. Making matters worse is the fact that the English language version is not always accurate and is garbled by this fake Old English dialect that I'm sure was intended to make Miracle Warriors more immersive. But if you're old enough to remember games like Ultima, or if you were like me and invented your own storylines to old video games and drew all of your own maps, which is something I really love to do, then Miracle Warriors can be very immersive and fun. It is in many ways beautifully crafted, especially all of these cool enemy sprites, and even now it can provide a rich and fulfilling adventure for the open-minded. Just, good luck getting anywhere near beating this game without looking up at least some hints online. Miracle Warriors is as amazing as it is baffling. The best RPG for the Sega Master System is unequivocally the original Phantasy Star, which came to North America in 1988. As a turn-based JRPG loosely based on the original Dragon Warrior, Phantasy Star did a lot of very original things. First off, as far as I know, this is the first console RPG to use a sci-fi world setting as opposed to medieval fantasy. Phantasy Star takes place across multiple planets in the Algo solar system and involves spaceships, laser guns, robots, biodomes, and all that jazz. Second, this is the first RPG that I know of that has a female protagonist, and it's also the first RPG that I am aware of that included in-game cutscenes with meaningful dialogue between characters that forwarded a progressing story. Technically, in 1988, Phantasy Star was a marvel, with a great soundtrack, beautiful artwork, an immersive setting, and spectacular 3D dungeons that encouraged gamers to get out that grid paper and start map making, which for me was always the best part about old RPGs. Sure, by today's standards, things like grinding and the unforgiving dungeons of death are no longer acceptable to the mainstream, but at the time this was, no shit, the best game of its kind and possibly the single best Master System game ever made. Ever. One of the most beloved action RPGs ever developed for the Master System was Gobelius by Compile, and it frequently gets compared to The Legend of Zelda, but outside of the overhead perspective and open world adventure element, the two games have very little in common. Gobelius, being a Compile game, is mostly about action and killing as many critters as possible so you can buy upgrades from one of these really mean old ladies, who all happen to live in holes in the ground. The point of the game is to kill the bad guy and save the princess and stuff, but figuring out how to pull this off is a serious challenge when everyone you talk to in this game is such an incredibly unhelpful asshole. You're better off just going online and reading a guide or watching a video. Otherwise, the graphics and sound for the Master System are solid, and this is one of those games that makes great use of the FM sound unit. In Japan, Gobelius was originally released for the MSX PC in Japan in 1987, but the Master System version from '88 is a solid experience for people craving some sword-swinging madness. It isn't a great game by any means, but it is extremely memorable with all of its cute cartoon snakes and weird fairies and bizarre scrolling dungeons that play out like this. Seriously, look at this. This is a scrolling dungeon. Now that's entertainment. The Japanese studio known as Compile developed a number of great games for the Sega Master System, but one of their greatest achievements wasn't publicly credited to them at the time of the game's release in 1988. And I'm talking about RType. which was a monumentally successful arcade game by Irem that was ported to many platforms in the 80s, and surprisingly, one of the best ports was on Sega's 8-bit Wonder. But because Sega subcontracted development to Compile, and because Irem owned the rights to the game, there's no indication at the title screen or on the game box that you're playing a Compile game. Now, anyone who knows retro shooters knows Compile because they were one of the greatest developers in that genre during the 80s and 90s. Indeed, I think they're the best, and their technical expertise in this field seems to have paid off here because RType on the Master System is incredible, especially when played with the FM sound unit. Most everything that made RType such a great game is here, including the iconic spaceship battle on level 3 and all of the crazy sprites, though admittedly many are shrunken down and there's a ton of flicker when things get crazy. But Compile did include this secret level with its own music and unique sprite work reminiscent of the game Salamander or Life Force. I know of no definitive proof that Compile is really the studio that developed RType on the Master System, but that crazy secret level and the overall quality of the game are indeed clues pointing in that direction. RType is an essential game on the Master System for fans of shooters, but be warned, it's a real nutcracker. Compile was very prolific in the 80s, producing many fun space shooters, but their best work on the Sega Master System was definitely Aleste, a 1988 sequel to Zanuck, and the precursor to a whole series of fantastic games, including the incredible Musha on the Sega Genesis. Like just about all Compile games of the time period, Aleste started out as a Japanese PC game on the so-called MSX format, but Compile always had a special relationship with Sega, and Aleste performs incredibly well on the Master System. Actually, it was known as Power Strike in the West, but I prefer the Aleste name, and since the game makes great use of the Japanese exclusive FM sound unit, greatly enhancing the game's outstanding soundtrack, I think we'll just stick with the Japanese version. What makes Aleste so great is the same basic formula that drives all of Compile's best shooters from this time period, and that's the game's heavy emphasis on granting the player insane, over-the-top firepower in the form of a constantly shifting power-up system, which basically means the way you play is constantly changing. So despite being a vertical scrolling shooter that forces you in one direction, the player never gets bored because there's always another way to approach the same level. Some power-ups, for instance, are heavily defensive, or encourage the player to engage in close combat. Others reward your precision, or encourage you to maintain a safer distance. Personally, I prefer to stick to one weapon and max out its potency by collecting as many of this yellow Powerball thingy as possible. They rack up points, which means extra lives, and they make your special weapon more powerful. While Aleste, especially early on, lures you in with the false sensation of your godlike power and destructiveness, the difficulty very quickly ramps up, and like most shooters, losing your power-ups will reduce you to an almost helpless level of suctitude. But this game and all of its constant positive feedback will suck you back in, and soon it will own your ass. Aleste is easily one of the 10 best games ever made for the Master System. In the late 80s, the biggest and baddest game around was definitely Double Dragon. It had over-the-top violence, it introduced drama, it had an outstanding soundtrack, and best of all, it was two-player, allowing players to surround and brutally bash the bastards who kidnapped your girlfriend. Everyone loved Double Dragon, which is why home ports of the game were a big deal back then. Lots of people remember the NES Classic, which has its merits, but in our opinion, the best home version of Double Dragon by far was on the Sega Master System in 1988. Graphically, the colors are a bit limited, and there's tons of flicker, but the sprites are surprisingly faithful to the arcade original, and the game plays without too much slowdown. And best of all, this version retains two-player simultaneous co-op, something that the NES version had to drop. Pretty much everything that made Double Dragon a hit is here. The brutal opening cutscene, the jump kicks, the brain-bashing moves, whips, flying barrels, and those monster sprites that look like Tommy Lister Jr. Even the awesome soundtrack was done well, especially if you had access to the Japanese FM sound unit. With that bad boy equipped, Double Dragon on the Master System becomes a must-have game, and a great reason to gloat and lord it over your dumb friends that are stuck playing with themselves on their ridiculous NES. One-player Double Dragon is about as stupid as playing Duck Hunt without the zapper, or Hang On without the motorcycle, or Space Harrier without the psychedelic mushrooms. It's just not the same experience, dude. Double Dragon on the Sega Master System isn't perfect. Some people struggle with the controls, or are bothered by the flicker. Obviously, this is flawed, but not even the arcade game was really that technically sound at the time of its release, with all that slowdown. But in the context of 1988 and what was possible in your living room, this was considered a great game, and it's still fun to play today if you bring the right perspective. The Sega Master System had a lot of good games on offer in 1988, but I think the very best that year was the feudal Japanese horror game known as Kenseiden, which according to Google Translate, which is never wrong, means
Sword Shrine.
I mean, that sums it up perfectly, I think. At first glance, Kenseiden looks like it's gonna be a straightforward side-scrolling action platformer, but there's nothing straightforward about Kenseiden, because frequently you'll need to go backward, up, then down, inside a bunch of doors, and to and fro across many different Japanese prefectures, which are all accessible on this map screen. Time to get Google Translate again. Anyway, yes, Kenseiden is actually an open-ended adventure game with action platforming mechanics. Dare I say it, it's a Metroidvania in 1988. You've got to explore all these prefectures and get all the necessary power-ups to turn your samurai warrior into a demon-slaying powerhouse. Destroy this wheel of death and you get the high jump. Kill this big dude with a club and you learn a new sword technique. Survive this monk's obstacle course of flying arrows, and you get a fatter health bar. And you'll need all of this because Kenseiden is a tough bastard of a game. Enemies are fast, agile, and unrelenting, while you're slow, methodical, slow, suffer from annoying kickback upon taking damage, and did I mention that you move stiffer and slower than a frozen jar of molasses? Unfortunately, there are no power-ups to speed up walking or to stop flinching like a ninny every time something smacks you, so you'll have no choice but to get really good, dude. The graphics in Kenseiden are phenomenal, and artistically, this may be the single best looking game on the Master System, a console that had really nice looking graphics to begin with. Sound-wise, well, not so much, unless of course, you have access to the Japanese exclusive FM sound unit. Well then, this game sounds great too. An open-ended adventure, samurai ghosts, killer medieval monsters, secret sword techniques, awesome graphics, challenging but fun gameplay, and compatibility with the FM sound unit? Now that's a recipe for success. Sadly, despite being awesome, Kenseiden never got a sequel, and is barely remembered by anyone today. But at the very least, now someone else knows about one of the greatest Master System games of all time. It's Kenseiden. Alex Kidd, Sega's one-time would-be mascot, returned to the Sega Master System in 1988 with Alex Kidd and the Lost Stars, a home port of a Sega 16-based arcade game of the same name, which featured Alex and his female friend Stella in a two-player action platformer that was known for its charming graphics and distinct sounds, especially that death scream. Well, the Master System version of Alex Kidd and the Lost Stars is very similar, only the graphics are far less charming. Alex seems to have dumped poor Stella, and that screaming sound he makes is worse than ever. And you will hear it a lot in this deceptively simple, yet frequently unfair platformer that features endless bullshit and some horrendously mean hit detection. Alex Kidd is the fragilest of children who will whine and scream, as literally everything that even gets close to him will absolutely destroy him. I guess once you memorize these levels, things turn out a little bit better for Alex, but for a game that plays like it's geared toward experts, there sure isn't a whole lot going on with these levels. Everything is kind of bland. Thus, Alex Kidd and the Lost Stars is the proverbial coconut of the Sega Master System games. It's really hard to get into, and yet once you do, it surprisingly sucks, and can make some people sick enough to go into anaphylactic shock. At the same time, this is Alex Kidd we're talking about here. He was Mr. Master System. So as far as that goes, here's to you, Alex, and poor Stella, wherever she is, we salute you. Frequently, people will point out that the Sega Master System lacked much support from major third-party game developers. But while that's mostly correct, Sega's 8-bit wonder did in fact enjoy at least some noteworthy support from a few major game developers outside of just Sega. This includes a few games that were actually developed by Taito, the legendary company that created Space Invaders. The best of these Taito-created games for the Master System is probably 1988's Final Bubble Bobble, which remained a Japanese exclusive until it was released in Europe in the early 90s. So this is one of those Master System games that completely missed North America. And what a loss too, because this is the best home version of what was one of the best arcade games of the 80s. Bubble Bobble is a 2-player arcade platformer about 2 boys cursed to be cute dragons and their girlfriends. They have to fight monsters with their magical bubbles, collect treats and treasure for points, and survive something like 200 levels, including some surprisingly epic boss fights and secret rooms galore. Final Bubble Bobble offers so much more than other versions of the game. The NES version, for instance, has about half as many levels and features worse graphics. But no matter which version you played, this game was always a lot of fun. I guess the only drawback is the music, which sounds like an ice cream truck. It's fun at first, but by level 100 it's gonna start driving you batshit crazy. There are some other songs in the game, but this one song is the most prevalent by far. Of the few Sega Master System games that stayed in Japan, Taito's Final Bubble Bobble is our pick for the very best, even though it did eventually go to Europe. That's it for the Master System in 1988, which was a totally phenomenal year for the console. Indeed, as far as Japan and the US go, 1988 was kind of the end of the Master System altogether. 1989 would see the US launch of the Sega Genesis, and with it, emphasis on the Master System in Japan and North America would practically come to a complete stop. But in Europe in 1989 and the early 90s, the Master System was really only getting started, thanks to developers in the UK and the fact that the new Sega Game Gear was, practically speaking, nothing more than a portable Master System in new plastic casing. There would be a steady flow of new games for Sega's 8-bit console for at least a few more years. Again, mostly in the form of Game Gear games that were repackaged and resold as Master System games. But there were some great unique games in 1989. So let's take a look. Now, in 1989, Sega of Japan essentially completely gave up on the Master System, instead opting to favor the Mega Drive, which was in its second competitive year, and not doing as well as they would have liked either. Indicative of this shift is the fact that Japan didn't get a release of the 1989 port of the arcade hit Rampage, when both the US and Europe, in fact, did. What's even more surprising about this is the fact that the home port of Rampage is not only considered to be one of the very best available, but it was actually done by Sega themselves. The original Rampage arcade game was developed by Bally Midway and hit the arcades in 1986. The gameplay was unique for the time, and that remains the case even long after. Players controlled 3 large King Kong-sized monsters and competed for points and survival as they climbed up city buildings and smashed them into smithereens. Once all the buildings are reduced to rubble, it's on to the next level. The game was a huge hit, and it was eventually ported to more than a dozen different microcomputers and game consoles, including the NES. But arguably, the best version was the Sega Master System port, which had great graphics, and thanks once again to that FM sound unit, the best sound of any version out there. It also allowed for 2-player simultaneous co-op, featured all 3 monsters from the arcade, and was all around a very faithful recreation of the game's mayhem. Perhaps after a while Rampage can get a little repetitive, but with friends for at least a half hour or so, Rampage is a raucous good time, and a great homage to the sci-fi and horror movies of cinema's golden age too. And how about that? Now, even though in 1988 Sega of Japan stopped releasing games for the Master System in Japan, early in 1989 there was one game that snuck by and got a Japanese release. and that's Bomber Raid, an original vertical scrolling shooter by the excellent Sanritsu, a small video game company that would work exclusively with Sega to develop some of the best Master System and Game Gear games of the early 90s, eventually under the name Sims. Bomber Raid is an old school affair which takes its inspiration from Capcom's arcade classic 1942, both being World War II themed scrolling shooters that emphasized gaining wingmen to increase your firepower whilst dodging little orange bullets. But Bomber Raid also takes its inspiration from other arcade hit makers like Konami, and I think even Compile, and the result is a solid shooter that not enough people ever talk about. In Bomber Raid, you fly this little propeller-based World War II plane, so you can totally ignore this badass looking SR-71 Blackbird on the box art. You never see anything like that in the game at all. The game consists of 5 lengthy and challenging missions, where you, the bomber, and your wingmen are given the objective to destroy a particular military target that serves as the end of stage boss. As always, this means dodging enemy bullets, avoiding colliding with objects, and destroying basically everything that moves. Along the way, you can power up your guns by charging up and then nabbing these little P icons. And you can change the flight formation of your easily killed wingmen by shooting and toggling through one of 4 red numbers that fly through the sky. Bomber Raid is a relatively straightforward but well-crafted shooter, and it is, in my opinion, one of the best games of its kind for the Sega Master System. If you enjoy challenging games or shooters, then Bomber Raid is definitely a game that you'll enjoy. RPGs. While the Sega Master System is very famous for the original Phantasy Star, the console surprisingly had very few notable RPGs. But in 1989, North American Master System owners would have had the option of playing the original Ys. Ys? Like Easy Cheese? No. Ys. Ys is one of the OG JRPGs from the 1980s. It was originally a PC game that appeared on the PC-88 in 1987, but it was soon ported to many other platforms including the Master System. The definitive version of this game would be released for the TurboGrafx CD-ROM early in 1990, but until then, Sega's 8-bit wonder was the only easy way to play Ys in North America. By today's standards, and even the standards of the mid-90s, Ys is incredibly primitive. It has a very simple story, rooted in fetch quests, little dialogue, and a fairly tiny world to explore with a few big maze-like dungeons. The battle mechanics infamously involve simply bumping into enemy sprites. If you're lucky and of sufficiently high level, or well equipped, with good weapons and armor, well then you'll win and not take damage. If not, then you will take damage, and very soon, you will die. Perhaps this method is a little simple, but I do find the simplicity to be charming, and the flow and progression of the game to be very fun, even if it only lasts for a few hours. The music, however, is phenomenal, especially when using the incredible Japanese FM sound unit. But even without it, it's still great. Upgrading your character and becoming more powerful is addictive. The dungeons are fun to explore, and even the boss fights, with this game's action-oriented approach, are pretty great. Ys the Vanished Omens isn't the best RPG on the Master System, but it's still pretty good, and it's a piece of gaming history that's worth experiencing at least once, especially on their TurboGrafx CD-ROM. One of the strangest games ever released on the Sega Master System was Spellcaster. A fall of 1989 release in North America, Spellcaster was originally called Kujaku-O in Japan, and is actually based on a popular late 80s manga of the same name. That manga origin is evident in Spellcaster because it is a heavily story-driven game with numerous NPCs to interact with, and even a certain amount of exploration and problem solving. But mostly this is a very odd side-scrolling platformer with some stiff movements and this very large, very awkward looking character sprite to control. It's not bad, but it is safe to call it uncomfortably different. You can shoot various magical projectiles, which can be switched out by conveniently pressing pause on your Sega Master System console itself. I mean that literally. In order to pause, you have to get up and press it on the console. And basically, you fight your way across haunted Japanese shrines, face a boss or two, and open up new dialogue, exposition, and even places to visit as you try and solve the mystery of what in the hell is happening in this game. I don't even understand any of this. I'm sure fans of the manga will understand more about what's supposed to be going on with this strange setting and all of these characters, but it's a little fuzzy. And I'm sure the 1989 translation probably doesn't help things. An element that makes this game very unique are the point-and-click adventure segments in between levels. And here's where you get to sleuth around for clues, interact with various characters, and eventually unlock more dialogue that will open up new levels and key items needed to beat the game. It reminds me a bit of playing Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, and it's an aspect of the game that creates a feeling of suspense and mystery that really pulls me in, especially when coupled with this game's excellent music. Even if I don't really like the story or characters much, I still find this game to be very fun and interesting to play. The action-based levels are actually quite impressive for the Master System, and it's really cool to be able to mess around with all of these devastating magical attacks. Pick the right ones for the right situation, and you'll soon realize why this is called Spellcaster. Spellcaster would actually get a sequel on the Sega Genesis called Mystic Defender, but with all of the unique adventure and point-and-click elements removed. But with these unique adventure and point-and-click elements, I actually find that I much prefer the Sega Master System original. Spellcaster is a bit of a hidden gem, but only kind of though. Sega's Master System actually had a lot of unique games, but one of the most interesting is Cho Onsenshi Borgman, or Sonic Soldier Borgman, which is based on an anime of the same name that was produced for Japanese television in 1988. Being based on an anime of the current year, Sega created Borgman exclusively for the Japanese market, but oddly enough, the game was brought over to the Sega Master System in North America by Activision, and the title was changed to Cyborg Hunter, which is a name that suits this game very well. Cyborg Hunter is pretty short, peculiar, and once you understand it, actually a lot of fun, but figuring out what you're supposed to do is a challenge. So you're like this RoboCop looking dude who's got to pass through 7 different areas labeled A through G in order to find all of the weapons, armor, and special abilities required to defeat the bad guys at the end of the line, and some sort of alien space base that the hero has infiltrated. Each area is a distinct little side-scrolling maze of long hallways and elevators, and hidden throughout are monsters to fight and items to collect. The first quirk you'll notice is this game's baffling HUD. This helpful map shows your location on the stage, but this baffling thing in the corner is just there to tell you that you're close to an enemy. I guess this is helpful, maybe? The second baffling thing about this is that it requires a second controller to play, despite the fact that it's a one-player only game. You'll have to access an in-game menu screen and switch between all these different weapons and abilities in order to get past all of these crazy monsters. But the Sega Master System controller only has 2 buttons and a D-pad. One button jumps, the other attacks. The pause button is all the way over on the console itself and, well, all it does is pause the game. So in order to open and close the item select menu, you'll have to push either button 1 or 2 on the second controller. It's a little convoluted, but it works. As with all games of this variety, finding new weapons and abilities is where it's at, and hunting down monsters and sending them to their final reward is as satisfying as anything. But you'll also have to figure out how to use these quirky elevator controls. Even just operating the elevator in this game takes some getting used to, but once you learn to play, have a few cool guns, and this badass jetpack, then you'll soon begin to see why Cyborg Hunter is a lot more fun and interesting than what your initial frustrated impressions might tell you. Cyborg Hunter was definitely one of the best Master System games of 1989. So yeah, not a ton of games came out to the Sega Master System in either Japan or North America in 1989. Once again, that was the same year that the Sega Genesis debuted, and Sega was ready to move on. But in Europe, Australia, Brazil, and so forth, it's a completely different story. And despite being more or less over, there were still some great games released for the Master System in '89, but easily the best was Wonderboy 3: The Dragon's Trap, a side-scrolling open-world adventure game that put Nintendo Zelda 2 to shame. Wonderboy as a series had an odd progression. The original was a classic platformer, the sequel, Monsterland, parodied adventure games, but Wonderboy 3 is the real deal, with a relatively large game world full of interconnected areas, each with their own theme and special considerations. The game starts off where Monsterland left off. Wonderboy defeats the dragon, but is immediately cursed to become a fire-breathing lizard, and in order to lift the curse, he must go on an elaborate quest for the Salamander Cross. But in order to achieve that ultimate goal, he will be essentially cursed to be many other things, in addition to a fire-breathing lizard man, including a mouse that can walk on walls, a piranha man that can breathe underwater, a hawk man that flies, and a mighty lion man that basically just kicks ass with a sword. Each time Wonderboy changes form, his new abilities will allow him to progress farther into the game, unlocking new items and abilities that will allow him to challenge progressively powerful dragon bosses, as well as opening up new areas to explore or easy shortcuts to allow convenient backtracking. Often, areas will require you to return multiple times, equipped with different abilities, in order to dig deeper into this charming but sometimes bewildering open world of wacky, cartoonish environments. While Wonderboy 3: The Dragon's Trap involves plenty of fun action-filled platforming and monster battling, it's less of an action game and more of an elaborate puzzle. And solving this puzzle will take a lot of time and experimentation as you gain awareness of all of the possibilities available to you with every new ability that you acquire. It's a challenging and exhilarating experience, especially the first time through. Wonderboy 3: The Dragon's Trap is easily one of the very best games ever made for the Sega Master System and is one of the best games of its era across all platforms. 1990. 1990 represents a major shift for the Sega Master System. The console at this point was completely finished in the country of Japan, where national attention had shifted towards the looming Super Famicom, which would be released in November of that same year. In the US, Sega of America was struggling to get the Sega Genesis going, with disappointing sales, in spite of an impressive national ad campaign about all the things that Sega did, while Nintendo don't. Only about a dozen Master System games were released in North America in 1990, and most of them were just ports of existing Sega Genesis games, which makes so little sense that I can't begin to fathom what Sega was thinking. Were they trying to discourage Master System owners from getting a Sega Genesis by offering the same games? Or were they trying to discourage Genesis owners from getting the power base converter that would have allowed for full backward compatibility with the Master System? Did they think people were going to buy Michael Jackson's Moonwalker twice? When, let's be real, they weren't going to buy it at all? But everywhere else that the Master System was sold in 1990 wasn't a bad year, but rather things just seemed to be heating up. And many more new games would be released throughout the early 90s. Now this was largely achieved thanks to the incredible ease it took to port Sega Game Gear games to the Master System, as well as thanks to the efforts of British developers like Tiertex, US Gold, Core, Probe, and so on and so forth. But Sega and their subsidiary Sims were also still quite active, and a surprising array of original games were specifically made for the European and Brazilian markets, such as Sega's unique port of Ultima 4, which some consider to be the best version of the game. Despite all of this activity and all of these hidden gems, such as Probe's cool take on the original Terminator movie in 1992, I mean, just look at this. The truth is that the home console market was vastly an American and Japanese phenomenon, and the Master System in Europe, though popular, was really just a part of a much more competitive microcomputer scene.
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
This year, Commodore's Family Pack is more value than ever. You get an education in computers with the new Commodore 64, all these extras, plus 4 very realistic games, like Le Mans Formula 1 racing, one-day cricket match, and the armchair official America's Cup computer game. The new Commodore 64 Family Pack, $499, keeping you ahead in the game of life.
For many, the best original Sega Master System game released in 1990 was Alex Kidd in Shinobi World, a North American and European exclusive that was developed in Japan by Sega as a kind of parody of the original Shinobi arcade game, only now starring 80s mascot Alex Kidd in the place of Joe Musashi. The result is what many regard as the greatest Alex Kidd game ever made, even if it is less than half as long as your conventional Alex Kidd games, at around 20 minutes in length. Granted, you make no error while playing. Alex Kidd is out having a good time with his girlfriend when an evil ninja swoops down and steals his lady. The grief-stricken Alex seems to pray as an ancient spirit of a ninja master comes to his aid, imbuing Alex with all of his shinobi powers so that Alex can rescue his girlfriend and save the world. Being based on the Shinobi arcade game from 1987, Alex Kidd in Shinobi World is a side-scrolling platformer, but thanks to being possessed by a ninja spirit, Alex Kidd can do a lot of cool stuff. Alex's main attack is a sword, but hidden in each stage of the game are chests that either allow Alex to upgrade to the power sword or a shuriken weapon with infinite ammo. Alex can also wall jump, he can duck, but the coolest thing he can do in this game is climb poles and ropes, which upon hitting the action button allow him to spin around until he becomes a flaming projectile that can fly across the screen, smashing through enemies and bricks. Also hidden in some areas are ninja magic icons that will envelop Alex in a tornado, allowing him to temporarily fly in any direction whilst destroying everything in his path. Alex Kidd in Shinobi World is short, but each of its dozen or so mini levels are exceptionally well crafted and completely distinct from one another. Each offer unique challenges and tons of secret areas that reward exploration. This game also features some of the cleanest looking graphics on the Master System and one of the very best soundtracks as well. Alex Kidd in Shinobi World is an outstanding game. In the early 90s, there were a lot of interesting original games for the Master System that were exclusive to Europe and the so-called PAL territories that utilized phase alternating line televisions as opposed to the NTSC standard used by the United States and Japan. Double Hawk is one such game from 1990. Even though Double Hawk was developed in Japan by a small company called Opera House, and even though it's plainly based on the Rambo movie series from the US, it's a game that was never officially available in either country. Despite its obscurity, I think Double Hawk is actually a really good game for the Master System. But what really makes it special is the fact that it's a two-player simultaneous co-op game, which is kind of a rare thing for Sega's 8-bit console. Double Hawk is a rail shooter played with a cursor that's controlled by the D-pad whenever you hold down the fire button, which is, I'm happy to say, an auto-fire style attack button. Taking your fingers off of auto-fire allows you to control your character's position on the foreground, which of course is also controlled by the D-pad. And thus that's how the game is played. Hold down the fire button to move your cursor and eliminate as many enemies as you can within the time limit, and run around in the foreground in order to dodge the little blue bullets being fired at you. Dodge, shoot, shoot and dodge. You can also catch power-ups as they fall toward the ground, including bombs that you throw with button 2, or upgrades to your speed and machine gun. Double Hawk is a relatively simple arcade-style game, but it's one of the most original for the Sega Master System, and one of the best two-player experiences as well. 1991 was an important year for Sega, especially in the United States where Sega had a new CEO named Tom Kalinske, who had a 4-point plan to boost the annual sales of the Sega Genesis, which had been a disappointment for the company up until that time. This included drastically lowering the price of the Sega Genesis to $150, changing the pack-in game to Sonic the Hedgehog, introducing an edgy new ad campaign that chased teens, and emphasizing games that were made in America, suitable to American sensibilities. Essentially, Sega needed to be less weeb and more Gen X cool. This plan basically worked its intended magic, and annual sales for the Sega Genesis outperformed the Super Nintendo for a few years. But 1991 was also the last year that Sega of America would release any new Master System games, and only 7 new 8-bit games were released that year. In Japan, the Master System was long done at this point, but in Europe and PAL territories, 1991 seems to be one of the biggest years ever, with nearly 40 new games released for the year, which isn't a lot to be sure, but it was a lot for the Master System. And as it turns out, some of these new Master System games were among the best ever made for the console. One of the best games released for the Sega Master System also became one of the console's most obscure due to its late release date and confusing title. Golden Axe Warrior is not an 8-bit port of Sega's fantasy-themed beat-em-up, but rather it's a Zelda clone that uses the Golden Axe lore and setting as the background for an adventure. Death Adder, the main villain of the first Golden Axe, seems to have conquered the land known as Firewood, and even the heroes from the original game were apparently unable to stop his ruthless path of destruction. And now it's up to you, a brave anonymous warrior, to gather the 9 magical crystals hidden in various dungeons across the land in order to gather the power necessary to wield the legendary Golden Axe and put down Death Adder once and for all. I called Golden Axe Warrior a Zelda clone because that's what it is. It's so closely patterned off the original Legend of Zelda that it almost looks like an act of cynical piracy. But it soon becomes clear once you play that there's nothing cynical about the similarities to Zelda. This game isn't a mere copycat cash grab, it's actually an act of love that's been carefully crafted by a team of developers who plainly thought what a lot of us think about the Legend of Zelda, that it freaking rocks. And so does Golden Axe Warrior, which builds upon the strengths of the original Zelda formula so as to, in many ways, improve upon it without negating it. Golden Axe Warrior then is what I wish Zelda 2 had been all along, a new adventure with a new open world to explore. But Golden Axe Warrior also includes a lot of flashy magical spells, and eventually, you can set sail upon the high seas to open up even more of the world. Even better than that is the fact that the English translation is actually really good. I was never confused by any English, and NPCs, when they weren't blatantly robbing me, could be actually helpful. Golden Axe Warrior is not perfect. It's tough to use this sword in the beginning because it's shifted ever so slightly to the right hand side, and it's not always clear where you're supposed to go. But then being lost and solving your own problems is one of the most satisfying aspects of games like this. This is easily one of Sega's best games for the Master System, and one of the best adventure games that Sega ever made. Without a doubt, the most important new game released by Sega in 1991 was Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis, a series that would temporarily reverse the fortunes of Sega and essentially define the company straight on into the present. However, it sometimes surprises people to learn that months after the Genesis release of Sonic, a version was also released for the Master System. What's even more surprising is that it's actually a completely different game, with its own unique design, levels, and music, and that it was created by a small brand new game studio that was erected solely for the purpose of porting Sonic to Sega's 8-bit consoles. Indeed, within weeks, a similar version of the Master System Sonic the Hedgehog would also show up on the Game Gear. A very similar game, but not quite the same. The new studio entrusted with this job was called Ancient, and it was founded by famous video game composer Yuzo Koshiro, who arranged Sonic's excellent Master System tunes, while his sister Ayano Koshiro did the game's artwork, and their mother Tomo Koshiro ran the office. The family hired a programmer and another graphic designer to work on the game as well, but overall it's safe to say this was a family affair. And for being Ancient's first game, the Master System version of Sonic the Hedgehog is excellent. Some say it's better than the Sega Genesis version, and as far as pacing, level design, and the controls are concerned, I kinda think I agree with that sentiment. Sonic on the Master System plays like a dream, and thanks to Yuzo Koshiro, has one of the best soundtracks of any game made for Sega's 8-bit console, and that's without Sega's fancy FM sound unit. This version of Sonic was pretty much unknown in North America, though it was released here, but for many people in PAL territories, this was the Sonic that they knew and loved. As for Ancient, their next game project would be a major contributing role in the development of Streets of Rage, a game where once again Koshiro and his sister Ayano would team up to produce the game's artwork and music, and that's a cool way of doing things. 1991 was the last year Sega released any new games for the 8-bit Master System in North America, but their best game that year was undoubtedly the Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, which was based on the Sega Genesis game of the same name that was released late in 1990. If you're a big fan of Sega, then you probably already know that the Castle of Illusion on the Genesis is widely regarded as a classic, which is why people were so happy to see that game released on the Sega Genesis Mini a few years back. But the Master System version is actually a completely different game with totally unique level designs and game mechanics that make it the best version of the game under the Castle of Illusion name, period. Indeed, Castle of Illusion for the Sega Master System is arguably the best game ever made for Sega's 8-bit console. Sure, being an 8-bit title, it lacks the high detail of the Genesis version, and the cutesy tunes kinda sound hollow and tinny, but the levels are very cleverly designed and offer a challenge beyond that of mere reflexes. Mickey Mouse moves at a nice quick speed, and there's none of the slowdown that plagued Castle of Illusion on the Genesis. And while you no longer have the option to shoot projectiles, Mickey can still perform his patented butt smash, and now you have the option of picking up certain objects and either throwing them at enemies or using them to solve simple yet inventive puzzles. Everything about Castle of Illusion on the Master System is done exceptionally well. Even the boss fights are more interesting than what was on offer on the Genesis. Both versions of this game are good, but Castle of Illusion for the Master System is one of the all-time greats by Sega. (1992). By 1992, the Sega Master System was completely dead as a console in both Japan and North America, but in PAL territories, it was business as usual, thanks largely to cross-development with the Game Gear, which was based on the Master System's basic hardware. However, there were still good games being made exclusively for the Master System that were not simply recycled Game Gear games. Let's look at two that were exclusive to Europe. Sonic 2. Sonic 2 was released in 1992 for both the Sega Master System and the Game Gear, right alongside the release of Sonic 2 for the Genesis. The 8-bit version of the game, however, was actually not developed by Sega, but rather subcontracted to a small new game studio called Aspect, who would go on to be prolific developers for the Game Gear, handling most of the future 8-bit Sonic titles going into the future. And much like the Master System version of the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2 was surprisingly not only a completely different game, it was also very fun to play. Unlike the Genesis version, which opens with the traditional Emerald Hill Zone or Green Hill Zone, the Master System version of Sonic 2 features a mountainous volcano full of hidden areas, and the ability to ride minecarts on rails. Indeed, each level of this beautifully crafted game features some new game mechanic to ensure that you never get too bored. Most famously, this version of Sonic introduces hang gliding through the clouds, which just looks fantastic on the 8-bit Master System. There's always something new to look forward to. The only real drawback this time around is that Sonic 2 is quite a bit harder than its predecessor on the Master System, or its cousin on the Genesis. There are no level checkpoints, and levels will have to be memorized in order to avoid the many unforgiving hazards. But the gameplay is so smooth and has so many clever moments to change things up that a little frustration does little to deter my interest. I guess it is a shame you can't play as Tails, but he makes plenty of appearances in the game. And indeed, unless you get all of the Chaos Emeralds and rescue him, the poor little guy dies at the end. One of the most interesting games released for the Master System in 1992 was Ninja Gaiden. And no, this is not a port of either the arcade game or the popular NES game of the same name. No, Ninja Gaiden for the Sega Master System was 100% a brand new game developed by Sims, a subsidiary of Sega that specialized in making original games for Sega's 8-bit consoles. And you know what? This might sound like heresy, but I think this is the best Ninja Gaiden game ever made. But take into account with my brash statement that I have little regard for the long-treasured NES series. So let me restate that. I think Ninja Gaiden for the Master System is the best action platformer made for the console. The gameplay mechanics are very similar to the NES series, with lots of wall jumping, ceiling hanging, sword slashing, and makes use of a lot of the same ninja magic that was popular on the NES series. The big difference here is with the level design. The levels in Sega's Ninja Gaiden are far more elaborate, and a lot less about expert platforming and luck, and much more about strategy and problem solving. There's a lot more vertical action in this game, as well as you'll find yourself ascending treetops, skyscrapers, and mountains. Enemy placement and pitfalls are still tough, but never unfair, and if you're thoughtful, there's always a reasonable workaround every challenge. Also, much like Ninja Gaiden for the NES, the music here is simply awesome, offering some of the most memorable foot-tapping jams for the Master System. I even think the storyline here is a big improvement over the NES, with some twists and turns, and an original enemy in the form of an evil, ghostly samurai. Ninja Gaiden on the Master System is really good, but unfortunately it was only released in PAL territories. Had it been produced in, say, 1987 and released worldwide, it would have been a massive hit for Sega for sure. So now let's look at 1993. By 1993, both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo were locked in fierce competition all throughout the world, and the poor old Master System was all but completely forgotten in places like the US and Japan. In PAL territories, however, the Master System had one last epic year, before finally waning in subsequent years. Let's take a look at some of the best games from 1993 that weren't primarily created for the Sega Game Gear or weren't ports of Sega Genesis games. In 1993, the Japanese game developer Compile would release one of their strangest games ever, Power Strike 2, a sequel to the original Power Strike game on the Master System, which was known as Aleste in Japan. Aleste would soon blossom into a successful series of games with a hardcore fanbase that persists to this day. Power Strike 2 would be a Europe exclusive. Released that same year, however, was Aleste 2 for the Japanese Game Gear, which was actually a completely different game, though it was developed for similar hardware at the exact same time. Why didn't Compile just make one game for the Game Gear and port it over to the Master System for a European release like everyone else did in the 90s? Because they're better than that, damn it. And that commitment to excellence really pours over into Power Strike 2, because this is probably the most technically impressive game ever made for the Master System, with vivid colors, insanely smooth scrolling graphics, featuring tons of fast, frenetic gameplay and screen-filling boss fights. It's insane to think that this level of action could be achieved on a console from 1985, but lo and behold, Compile made it happen. This is also probably the best shooter ever made for the console, even with its nutty steampunk aesthetic and storyline that takes place in the 1930s for some reason. I don't see how it makes any sense, but I don't care, with gameplay this explosively captivating. Other than all that, it's definitely an Aleste game, so that means constantly swapping power-ups and nabbing as many letter P's as possible in order to smash everything on the screen. Power Strike 2 is a masterpiece, and it's really sad and really weird that it wasn't a worldwide phenomenon. In 1986, Technos Japan released an arcade game that would revolutionize the industry. Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, the hot-blooded tough guy Kunio, was the first ever side-scrolling beat-em-up game that gave players the ability to move up and down on a 2D plane in addition to left and right. It also introduced combo cycling, grappling, and many of the most beloved beat-em-up cliches that would dominate the gaming industry for roughly the next 10 years, including jump-kicking thugs off of motorcycles, which is a CCP favorite. The game was released in the West as Renegade, and an enhanced version was ported to the NES in 1987, which included new levels and a difficult last stage culminating in a final boss fight. Many versions of Renegade were released across many platforms, but the last and greatest by far was the remake of the NES version of Renegade for the Sega Master System in 1993. The 1993 release, which was handled by Natsume, included greatly enhanced graphics, new enemy sprites, solid controls, fun fighting mechanics, and a great rockabilly theme that pervaded not only the game's soundtrack, but also its look, and most shocking of all, at least to me, a new final boss that looks suspiciously like Tom Kalinske. Come on, that's gotta be Tom Kalinske, right? Renegade for the Master System is one of the console's best beat-em-ups, but sadly, coming out exclusively in Europe and Brazil in 1993, it didn't didn't do much to enhance the console's portfolio, and has become sort of a mysterious oddity, more than a classic title. But for some people in the know, this odd little beat 'em up, which can be beaten in less than 20 minutes, is one of the best games on the Sega Master System. Just watch out for those cheap shots, or you're gonna end up being thrown out into a dumpster. In the 80s and early 90s, Konami's Castlevania was one of gaming's most celebrated experiences, with catchy music, gothic atmosphere, and the prospect of being able to slay the king of vampires himself, Count Dracula. If you played games during this time period, then you were at the very least familiar with the series, and its whip-slinging hero, Simon Belmont. The series was most prominent on Nintendo consoles, though the Sega Genesis would get its own excellent entry in the series in 1994 called Castlevania Bloodlines. This is all well known, but what a lot of people don't know is that in 1993, Sega would release its own knockoff version of Castlevania for the Game Gear, called Master of Darkness. That same year, a version for the Sega Master System was released exclusively in Europe. And though Master of Darkness is derivative of Castlevania, borrowing its secondary weapon concept, emphasis on stair climbing, horror fantasy setting, emphasis on stiff platforming, and even the final boss, which is once again Count Dracula, you might be surprised to hear that Master of Darkness is, in its own right, an excellent game, and perhaps, if it be counted, among the very best Castlevania games of all time. While the soundtrack in Master of Darkness isn't quite as impressive as Konami's Castlevania classics, it's still easy on the ears, and the graphics are some of the best ever on the Master System. Gameplay, on the other hand, is in many ways an improvement here, with tighter controls, the ability to swap out your main weapon, and there's not so much a knockback when you take a hit, which Castlevania veterans will tell you is one of the worst aspects of playing the original series. Indeed, overall, Master of Darkness, while not necessarily an easy game, is a much less frustrating experience than Castlevania, which was tailor-made to be as challenging as possible. The best thing about Master of Darkness, however, is the fun and interesting boss fights, which include a confrontation with Jack the Ripper, a psychic girl possessed by ghosts, a stock anime villain, another stock anime villain, and of course, Dracula, who seems to be based on the Christopher Lee version. Master of Darkness never really had a big audience when it came out, at least not in the US, but it's one of the best games ever made for the Sega Master System and the Game Gear. The Sega Game Gear was Sega's first portable console, released in Japan in October of 1990. For all intents and purposes, it was basically just a portable version of the 8-bit Sega Master System, which made porting games from the Master System to the Game Gear a breeze. But surprisingly, due to the prolonged success of the Master System in Europe and Brazil, porting games the other direction from the Game Gear to the Master System became every bit as useful for the two regions. That's exactly how many of their best Master System games began life, as Game Gear games. One of the best examples of this phenomenon is The Land of Illusion by Sega and Aspect, which is an 8-bit sequel of sorts to the Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. It was simultaneously released for the US Game Gear and European Master System in the summer of 1993, and it is one of the best platformers available for either of those consoles. The gameplay mechanics remain the same. Mickey can do a butt jump on top of enemies, and he can also pick up items to either use as projectiles or solve simple puzzles. New to the Land of Illusion is an overworld map that allows Mickey to backtrack to previous levels. This will become necessary later on as Mickey defeats bosses and unlocks new abilities that allow him to access previously inaccessible areas. Specifically, the rope item will allow Mickey to climb walls, and the potion will shrink him down so that he can reach small areas that would only be suitable for something like, say, I don't know, a mouse? I guess these areas are more for like something as small as a bug. Anyway, the point of all this backtracking is to find the 14 hidden stars scattered throughout the game. This increases Mickey's life meter up to 5, earns extra lives, and adds a bonus to your overall score. All things you're gonna want to do if you want to be the coolest kid in school. The Land of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse contains 14 colorful and inventive levels and is a more than worthwhile entry in one of Sega's greatest game series of all time. And so there you have it, 55 of what I think are the best possible games to include on a hypothetical Sega Master System Mini from the mid-80s through to the early 90s, comprising every available genre and emphasizing games exclusive to the console as they would have been experienced by most people. And while this isn't quite a best Master System games list, since there are a few gems that were not included here, it's pretty darn close as far as I'm concerned. So what do you all think of our list? Do you look forward to a Master System Mini? What games would you include? Please let us know this and more in the comments. And thank you very much for liking and subscribing. Doing so greatly helps our channel. Until next time, bye bye now.